Good evening. The next story, we are still on Daf Ayin Gimel Amid Beis 73b in Bava Basra, says as follows. For those of you who may be looking at a Gemara inside, we're on the third wide line of the Gemara. V'amar Rabba bar bar Chana, and Rabba bar bar Chana said, Zim nechada one time, Havaka Zluna Bisvinta, we were traveling on a ship. V'chazinan hahu kavra, and we saw a fish. Whoops, wrong story. I gotta jump down a few lines. Diyasvale chalsa agabe. We saw this fish, and there was some sand that had gathered on the back of the fish. V'kodach agma iluya, and there was like some swamp, or it seems to indicate in the commentators that some grass was growing on it, like some swamp grass. Savrinan, the people who saw this mud and sand over there, didn't realize that it was sitting on the back of a fish, and they assumed yabeshtihi, that it's dry land. Visalkinan, so they got off the boat and onto the back of the fish. Vafinan, they started baking, uvashlinan, and we were cooking agabe on the back of the fish. V'karcham, when things started heating up on the back of the fish, and it felt the fire burning on its back, chad gabe, ishapich, it flipped over. V'ilav dahava mekarva svinta, and if not for the fact that our ship was close by, hava tavinan, we would have drowned. So the first approach that we're going to take a look at is the Marsha, as well as the Kosev in the Ein Yaakov. Both understand the story as referring to a period of golus, of exile, when things are going relatively easy. That's sort of like the idea over here of being able to get off the ship. You see some dry land. You're feeling like even though you're in the sea, which, as we've discussed in some of the other stories, is a metaphor for traveling through difficulty. But in this case, you feel like you've discovered a place that looks comfortable. You can get off the ship. The Marsha specifically understands that it's referring to Golus Madai, the short period of time when the Medians were in charge of the Middle East. And you're there on top of the whale, you're having a fun time with a barbecue. The problem is that the whale can flip over any moment when you least expect it. And that's why we can never get too secure in Gullus, because we never know when our comfort in Gullus can suddenly, chas v'shalom, come to an end, something that we as a people have sadly experienced a few too many times. Rabbi Moshe Binyomin of Bavel, as well as Rav Yitzchok Isaac Chaver, offer similar approaches to this Gemara, and I'm going to offer a blended explanation of their commentaries. Our time in this world is temporary, and the primary purpose is to acquire mitzvos and other good deeds, and subsequently, after our time in this world, to enjoy the fruits of our labor. While we're in this world, it's like we're on a ship traveling from place to place. And keeping in mind the fact that it's only a temporary voyage helps us to resist succumbing to the temptations and the wiles of the Yetzer Hara. So here we have this person who's experiencing this world as he's traveling on the ship, and suddenly he sees the fish. And they understand that the fish in this case is a metaphor for the Yetzer Hara, for the evil inclination. And the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and we've sort of discussed this in the past also, contains within it the aspects of the Eitz Hada'as Tov V'Ra, of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which means that the Yetzer Hara has within it both the good side as well as the bad side. And actually, the good side is the side that is used in order to tempt people to think that that which is bad is really good. And therefore, the bit of the sand that's on the back of the fish, that's a metaphor for the Yetzer Hara's ability, for the evil inclination's ability to show something to a person and to convince him that what he's seeing is safe, dry land and not something which is apt to drown him. It's a place you can get out, relax a bit, take it easy. Sand, as we've learned in other stories, is a metaphor for creating a boundary and could be as being viewed as a boundary to keep out any evil. There's some grass growing on it. It looks like a nice, relaxing place to have your barbecue. But as the people get off the ship and climb onto the back of the fish and they're enjoying their barbecue, things begin to heat up. Because when you get too involved in the pursuit of the physical pleasures, then a person puts himself in a state of danger. And the people suddenly realized that they weren't eating because they were hungry, but rather they were eating because they were feeling gluttonous. And they realized that things were not as good as they imagined them to be. But that which they had originally saw as being a positive experience, Rav Yitzchok Isaac Chaver says, was now turning into a negative experience. And if they had not been near the boat representing the Shekhinah, the presence of Hashem, which is within each and every person, and can draw the person back to Hashem to do tshuva, they would have drowned, they would have succumbed within the temptations of the Yetzer Hara. Rev Moshe Binyomin Bavel says it a little bit differently. He says that when they saw the danger that they were in, and he understands the Svina, the ship, as being a metaphor for this world, they began to contemplate a little bit more about what this world is like and realizing its limitations. And that's what turned them around into rectifying their behavior. In another explanation, Rav Moshe Binyomin of Bavel wants to say that this story is an allusion to the Leviathan, the legendary fish that was created at the time of creation, and that, well, we're taught that in Messianic times, people are going to enjoy the flesh of the Leviathan. What does it mean to enjoy the flesh of the Leviathan? So actually, in the Zohar, there are two opinions. One opinion understands that it means quite literally that they are going to take the flesh of that fish and people are going to enjoy it. But the other opinion in the Zohar understands the eating of the flesh of the Leviathan as being a metaphor for basking in the presence of Hashem. Sort of like we find by Matan Torah, by the giving of the Torah. It says, Vayechzu es Elokim vayochlu vayishtu, that they saw God, and it was like they were eating or drinking, because the spiritual sustenance that they were getting was akin to the physical sustenance of eating and drinking. So in the same way, that opinion says that even though the Gemara speaks all the time about eating from the Leviathan, but it's not meant to be literal, but rather it's a metaphor for basking in the presence of God. And the Zohar goes on to say that Chazal saw how challenging Golus was, and they wanted people to have something to hold on to understand that there was something better waiting for us in the future. And that's why they told us that don't worry, even though it's difficult now, there's something better waiting for you at the end. So getting back to the story, they saw this fish as they were traveling on the ship. And again, the fish is a metaphor for the Levyasan. And there was sand on the back of the Levyasan. Now we know that Hashem told Avram Avinu that his offspring would be similar to sand. So therefore, according to this explanation, the sand is a metaphor for the Jewish nation. And the Jewish nation was being carried on the back of the Levyasan. The promise of having that Levyasan in the future, it was carrying Klal Yisrael through the waters, through the turbulence of Golus. And that's why there was grass growing there, because even though they were in Golus, that promise was helping them thrive. And they initially assumed that there was going to be a great Levyasan barbecue. Because if you read the literal words of Chazal, that's what it sounded like. And therefore, that's why it uses the metaphor that they started cooking, because that's what they were expecting. But then as they got a chance to start thinking about things a little bit more seriously and with a little bit more of understanding, they changed their minds. That's the flipping of the fish. And they realized that it didn't make any sense that the great reward of the future was going to be just to eat some fish. And it must be like the other opinion in the Zohar, that the reward of the future was going to be to bask in the presence of the Shekhinah. But if we had not already been very close to the ship, if we had not already been very close to Hashem to begin with, we may have remained with the, shall we say, less mature understanding of assuming that it was literally eating from the flesh of the fish. One more explanation that we'll see is from Rebbe Nachman. Rebbe Nachman says, again, that this is a metaphor for being in Golus, in exile, and that while we're in exile, Hashem is in a state of hastoras panim. Hastoras panim means that Hashem hides his face. In Kabbalistic terms, the face turned towards something always indicates rachamim, mercy. When we're being shown the back of the head, that's din, that's judgment. And now we're in a state in which Hashem is showing us the back of his neck and not his face. And the point of all of our tefillos is we're asking Hashem to turn around. Yar Hashem panav, let Hashem shine his face upon us. Rabbi Nassan adds in Likutei Halachos that when Hashem is unresponsive, so that's metaphorically kaviyachol, as if Hashem is asleep, right? That we find, for example, in Megillas Esther, that one of the things that Haman said to Achashverosh is about Yeshno Am Echad, which literally means there is one nation. But the Gemara says that you can understand the word Yeshno as being based on the word Yashen. And that Haman was saying the God of the Jews is asleep because Hashem, when we were in Golus, had turned his back to us. But our tefillos can slowly change that, because the reality is Hashem is not asleep. It's just the situation gives us the impression that he is. The fact of the matter is that the great length of exile and the fact that frequently we don't see a quick response to our tefillos make people feel on occasion that their tefillos, their prayers, are going to waste. By the way, just as an aside, on this idea of that we want Hashem to shine his face upon us, Rabbi Nassan again comments something very beautifully. He says, do you know what is a state where Hashem is shining his face upon you? That's a state where you come to a true understanding within inside yourself of the truth of something about God. When you come to an understanding of Hashem's creation, of Yesh Mi'ayin, Hashem creating the world for nothing, or you come to a real understanding of the fact that Hashem keeps everything in existence, that is Hashem shining his face upon you. But as we said, oftentimes we don't feel that, and people get frustrated. But the tzaddikim in each generation, Rabbi Nachman says, lift up and affix the tfilos, each one in their place. And by doing that, they rebuild the stature of the Shekhinah little bit by bit until it's complete, until Mashiach will come and complete it entirely. The fish, he says, refers to the tzaddikim. We know that Yosef is referred to as Yosef HaTzadik. And one of the reasons is because Yosef refused to commit adultery with Eshes Potiphar. And we know that Chazal tell us that the fish also refrained from any sexual impropriety at the time of the Mabul. The sand on the back of the fish, Rabbi Nachman says, are our tfilos when we're asking Hashem to turn his face to us. And the grass growing is all the souls that gather there together with all of the prayers. And the people thought it was dry land. They thought that the tfilos, the prayers, were lifeless, but the reality is things were cooking. Because as there were more tfilos, the presence of the Shekhinah was being built more and collecting to higher places, until it finally got to a point where the fish flipped over. It turned to Midas Hadin. It turned the trait of judgment of Hashem facing away from us to Midas Harachamim. And actually, the word in the Gemara is Gaba. Its back turned over. And Rabbi Nachman explains Gaba stands for Gvura, Bina, and Hod. Gvura, Bina, and Hod, and this isn't the place to get into a long discussion about it, but those are the spheros, those are the spiritual forces which represent din, judgment. Those flipped and turned around from judgment to kindness. If not for the fact that we were close to the ship, he says, is a metaphor for God's kindness, we may have ended up with nothing, because the fact of the matter is, even after all of our efforts, God doesn't owe us anything. Okay, thank you so much for listening. And Mirza Shem, in a few days, we will have the next shir. Have a good evening.